Hello everyone, it's Turnro here, bringing you the next tutorial video in my series of how to make cinematics using the Warcraft 3 world editor. Over the series so far, we have covered a lot in regards to how to make our own cinematics, from the absolute basics to the different techniques we can use in order to make our cutscenes interesting to watch for the viewer. And in this final tutorial video, we'll be covering an aspect that we have not yet covered, which is to do with cinematic skipping. Usually in PC games, there is an option that when there is a cutscene that is playing in the game, the player will be able to press the escape key on their keyboard in order to skip that cutscene and resume to the gameplay. Warcraft 3 also provides this feature, but when you're making your cinematics, it will not offer this functionality by default. You will have to rely on organizing your triggers in such a way so that players can skip your cutscenes if they choose to do so. So the idea essentially is we want to capture exactly at what point in time the player skips the cinematic or press escape on their keyboard, and then we want to modify the triggers so that it will stop playing the cutscene. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make an entirely new trigger, and we're going to call it cinematic skipped. And we want to have this trigger turned off by default because we only want the actions to trigger when the cinematic is actually running. So for the event, we're going to create a new event and we're going to give it the property of cinematic skipped. Providing you have the actual player selected, in this case we have player 1 as the actual player, it will run the following trigger. So the first action we are going to add is trigger turn off. And we want this here so that we only have this trigger once instead of multiple times depending on how many times the player clicks on escape on their keyboard. And what we want to do is we want to keep track of when the player skipped the cinematic by making use of a variable, and we're going to call it cinematic skipped. We're going to give it a type of boolean, meaning it can have one of two values, true or false. So it will start off with false by default, and then we select on cinematic skipped and we set it to true. Alright, so that covers this part. Now, what we want to do in addition to this is we want to actually stop this trigger from running. So overall, when this trigger is run for the first time, this trigger will not occur because it is currently turned off. So the first thing we want to do before the actual cutscene begins, we want to turn on the cinematic skip trigger. So we go into new actions, we go to T for trigger, and we go to turn on cinematic skipped. There we go. And at the end of the cutscene, we want to do the opposite. So right below here, we want to go T for trigger again, and we go turn off cinematic skipped. So far, so good. Now, in addition to doing this, we want to make it so that at any point when this part of the trigger is running, we want the trigger to not run anymore if the player actually escapes the cutscene. And how you do that in Warcraft 3 is a simple matter of adding in an if condition. So we go into new action, we go for an if, so it will simply be an if then else. So we do a boolean comparison of if the cinematic skipped is equal to true, then we do skip remaining actions, else do nothing. So the trigger will simply check if the player has skipped the cinematic, and if it has, then the below actions in the trigger will not run. And what we'll need to do is we will need to copy and paste this statement after every wait command that we have initiated within the actual game or the actual trigger. Now, depending on the length of your trigger, you could be doing this multiple times, but this is how it works in Warcraft 3. So now we have set up pretty much the basics of what we need to do in order to allow cinematic skipping. So what we're going to do is we're going to save what we've done, and we're just going to quickly test it. So here we have our usual cinematic that we have made during the past tutorial videos. I'm going to press escape on the keyboard, and there we go. The cinematic stops running. Now you would have noticed that when we actually escaped the cutscene, the cinematic mode, or the bars that occurred during cinematic mode, were still visible. And the reason why this is because we have done exactly what we have told our triggers to do. We've made it so that if the player skips the cinematic, the rest of the cutscene will no longer play. However, what we did not specify is that in addition to no longer running this trigger, we want the game in addition to exit out of cinematic mode. And how we do that is essentially the exact same way that we have done it since the very beginning, which is this part of the trigger here. Now, whereas it may be tempting to actually copy and paste this part of the trigger into here, it does create an issue called trigger duplication, which is where you have the exact same actions copied and pasted into multiple triggers, which can create problems because if there is an issue with the triggers that you have created, it means that you will have to remember every single spot that you have created that error. So instead of copying and pasting as such, what we want to do is we want to centralize these actions so that it is called from a central location. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new trigger, and we're going to call it Cinematic Cleanup. And what it will consist of is simply the exact same actions that we use in order to transition out of cutscene mode into gameplay mode. And then in the original cinematic trigger, we are going to delete this part of the trigger, and we are going to go action, trigger, run, cinematic cleanup. There we go. And now what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this exact same trigger call in the cinematic skipped trigger. So now we have centralized the transitioning of the cinematic mode. However, we can do one step further than this by actually separating this main cinematic trigger even more. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new trigger. We're going to call it Cinematic Setup. And in this trigger, we are going to essentially cut and paste everything in the beginning into this new trigger. So we're going to cut this, paste it in. We are also going to cut the event and condition, since this new cinematic setup trigger is going to initiate in the exact same way that we have done with our original cinematic trigger. And so down below at the very bottom, we are going to create a new action called trigger, run, cinematic. Now this step here is not really mandatory, but through experience through making cinematics, it does help a lot to actually cut the different aspects of the cinematic into different triggers to make it easier to manage. And this is personally how I set up all of my cinematic triggers. So there's essentially 4 main triggers. So you have a single trigger that starts off where its sole purpose is to transition from the game mode into the cinematic mode. Then we have a single trigger for the entire cutscene that we want to play, followed by a trigger that transitions the game from cinematic mode back into gameplay mode. And we also have a trigger that checks whether or not the player has escaped the cutscene. So at the moment, our cinematic seems to be in a good shape. So again, we are going to save and we are going to test run this again. So now if we press escape, you'll notice that the cutscene immediately ends and it comes back to where we started. For the specific cinematic that we have made, this is pretty much optimal for what we have. The only other situation is if you are making a cinematic that goes for an extended period of time, in which case your cinematic trigger will be quite large. And depending on its size, the editor can actually lag out due to the amount of actions or data you have put inside the trigger. And so if you are in this situation where you're making massive cinematics, my advice to you would be to separate this cinematic into separate triggers to make it more easily manageable for you. Such as if you have a cutscene which has multiple scenes, then you could have a trigger for each scene, for example. But other than that, this is pretty much how you allow players to skip cinematics in Warcraft 3, and which overall brings an end to the tutorial series in how to make cinematics for Warcraft 3. I hope you all found this tutorial video useful as well as the entire series. If you like this content, feel free to like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I look forward to creating additional tutorial videos for the Warcraft 3 world editor in the future. But until then, I'll catch you guys next time. Bye now.